The sound of metal scraping against soil woke me up before the sun had even broken the horizon. At first, I thought it was some stray animal, maybe raccoons again. But when I looked out my front window and saw two grown women in sun hats and matching leopard print leggings digging a winding trench through my perfectly mowed lawn like it was a public construction site, I almost dropped my coffee mug. One of them was jabbing the dirt with a garden spade, while the other laid down what looked like construction cones made out of pink spray-painted wine bottles. That's when I realized this wasn't a prank. This was real. The Karen sisters, yes, that's what the neighborhood called them, had decided to turn my front yard into their personal shortcut trail. And the worst part? They were waving at me like I should be thanking them. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to process the sheer absurdity of what I was witnessing. These weren't just any random neighbors. These were the HOA's self-appointed queens. Karen number 1, otherwise known as Cheryl, was the president of the neighborhood association, despite having won with 3 votes during a potluck meeting most people forgot to attend. Her younger sister, Karen number 2, a woman named Lorna who insisted everyone call her Lo, was the self-declared director of aesthetic pathways. I had once laughed at that title when I saw it on the HOA newsletter, assuming it was satire. It wasn't. Now here they were, trenching a curvy little walkway through my manicured front lawn like it was a community park. I stepped outside, trying to keep calm, though I could feel my left eye twitching. "Can someone explain what you're doing?" I asked. Cheryl didn't even look up. She just kept digging and said, "Improving the neighborhood, sweetheart. People need a way to cut through to the dog park. This route saves like 15 steps. We're thinking of calling it Karen's Trail." Lorna, who was carefully placing down decorative garden stakes shaped like flamingos, nodded with a proud grin. "It's for the community," she added. "You should be grateful you're part of the solution." I blinked. "You're digging through my property." Cheryl sighed dramatically and finally stood up. "Your property? Please. This is a shared-use buffer zone. We talked about it in the HOA's March newsletter. Page 6. The one with the banana bread recipe?" I shot back. "Right under that," she said smugly. "Look, if it bothers you, file a complaint. But we've already got verbal approval." "From who?" I asked. "From me," she replied. "And her," Lorna added, pointing at herself. I felt like I was being gaslit in real time. They truly believed this was their right. I pulled out my phone, took pictures of the trench, the tools, and their ridiculous flamingos, and let them know I'd be contacting the city. Cheryl shrugged and said, "Do what you gotta do, but this trail's gonna be a hit." That phrase echoed in my head for the rest of the day. I didn't know whether to scream, cry, or laugh. I started asking around. Turns out, the Karens had been whispering about this shortcut plan for weeks. They told people it would increase property value and foster neighborly connection. No one really knew it involved trespassing through my lawn. One neighbor admitted she thought they were just going to add benches on the main sidewalk. Another confessed she was too afraid to say no to Cheryl, who once fined her for hanging a beach towel on her porch railing. Cheryl and Lorna had manipulated the idea of community into something that gave them power. And now they were expanding their empire, starting with my grass. Later that afternoon, a yellow slip appeared in my mailbox. A notice of noncompliance from the HOA. Apparently, I had interfered with a beautification initiative. They were fining me $200 for obstruction of community flow. I actually laughed out loud when I read that. Obstruction of flow? What did they think I was, a dam? But my laughter faded fast when I realized this wasn't a joke to them. They were weaponizing the HOA, twisting its rules to push their agenda. And unless I did something about it, they'd just keep digging, literally and figuratively. The next morning, the trench was longer. The Karens had brought wheelbarrows. They even had a Bluetooth speaker blasting inspirational music while they worked. At one point, Lorna filmed herself on her phone giving a progress update, like she was hosting a home renovation show. "Here we are on day 2 of Karen's Trail," she announced. We're almost halfway to the sidewalk entrance. Thanks to Cheryl for hand-picking the gravel. I nearly choked on my coffee when she said, gravel. These maniacs weren't just digging, they were planning to pour a surface. I tried calling the city. Code enforcement said they'd investigate but warned me it might take a few weeks. The guy on the phone actually chuckled and said, "Let me guess. HOA ladies with too much time on their hands?" I sighed. You have no idea. That same afternoon, a neighbor named Jim slipped a folded piece of paper under my front door. It read, "They told me they're pouring stone by Friday." You didn't hear this from me. I looked out my window and saw Jim casually watering his lawn like nothing happened. By now, the Karens had started inviting neighbors to walk the trail. A few people, not knowing any better, strolled along it with their dogs or kids. Each time they did, more dirt was trampled into my yard, flowers got crushed, and my landscaping was destroyed. I felt like I was watching a slow-motion invasion. The worst part? Every time I confronted them, they smiled and said I was being anti-community. Cheryl even told me I needed to check my privilege and let others enjoy the space. That same day, she planted a tiny flag in my yard that read, "Freedom to roam." By Thursday, the situation had turned into a circus. People were walking through like it was a public park. Lorna handed out popsicles to kids who used the trail. A local dog trainer showed up with a full class. My yard, once the envy of the block, now looked like the warm-up lane at a county fair. I stared out the window and realized something had to change. Fast. I couldn't rely on the HOA. I couldn't rely on the city. And I sure as hell couldn't reason with the Karens. But there was one thing I could do. One card I hadn't played yet. Something bold. Something permanent. As the sun began to set, I made a call to an old friend who owed me a favor. He worked in concrete. Big jobs. Commercial pours. "How fast can you get me a truck and a crew?" I asked. "What are you pouring?" he asked. "Revenge," I said. "About 5 inches thick." He laughed, then said, "I like the sound of that. Midnight good for you." I looked outside. The trench stretched the entire width of my lawn now, a scar cutting across my property. "Perfect," I replied. "Let's make sure it dries by morning." And that's when the plan was set. If the Karens wanted a path through my yard, they were about to get one. But it wasn't going to be what they expected. Not even close. As the clock crept toward midnight, I stood in my garage sipping a cold drink, eyes fixed on the dirt path carved through my once immaculate lawn. The Karens had no idea what was coming. Their trail of terror had stretched all the way from the curb to my hedges, winding and uneven like a toddler had drawn it with a crayon. But soon it would be a path of polished gray concrete, firm as my resolve. I had spent the day quietly preparing, ordering materials, coordinating with my buddy Nate, who owned a small concrete company, and marking out the trench in a way that kept everything legal. I didn't want revenge that could backfire. I wanted revenge that lasted. Revenge with permit. Nate arrived with a team of 2 guys, a cement mixer truck nicknamed Big Bertha, and a half-dozen halogen work lights. As they set up, I explained the plan again. We weren't just filling the trench. We were building a professional-grade walkway, complete with edging, proper drainage slant, and a high-friction surface. And the best part? It was on my land, fully within my property line, and permitted as private use access. By the time the Karens woke up, their shortcut would be unrecognizable and unusable. Better yet, they'd have no legal recourse. I was fixing what they broke, just with a little artistic flair. Nate laughed as he saw the pink flamingo lawn stakes shoved into the dirt beside the trench. "You want me to leave room for these?" he asked sarcastically. "Absolutely not," I said. "In fact, toss them in the mixer. Let them live on as gravel." One of the crew members chuckled and began pulling up the tacky decorations, tossing them into a trash bin. The night had a strange energy to it, quiet but electric. The kind of calm before a neighborhood storm. We worked quickly. Nate's crew leveled the trench while Bertha churned and rumbled, pouring thick gray cement like it was icing on a cake of vengeance. I stood back, flashlight in hand, watching as each section filled in smooth and clean. It was satisfying in a way I hadn't expected. Not just because I was undoing what the Karens had done, but because I was reclaiming control. For the first time in days, I wasn't reacting, I was acting. As we neared the final stretch, I pulled out a small stencil I'd made earlier that day. It read, "Private property, no public access." Nate raised an eyebrow when he saw it. "You serious?" I nodded. "Dead serious. Let's stamp it right at the entrance." We pressed it into the semi-dry cement, just deep enough to be permanent but clean. Then I took it a step further, carving a faint line across the top layer every 2 feet, making it appear intentionally segmented, like stepping stones. They wouldn't just know it was private. They'd feel it. Then, just for good measure, I added a secret twist. In 3 spots, each near the middle of the path, I embedded thin rubber rods just under the surface. They wouldn't affect the structural integrity, but if someone stepped on the path while it was still curing, they'd slightly sink in and leave visible marks. It was a trap, not of pain or punishment, but of proof. If the Karens touched it before it was set, their footprints would be waiting for them in the morning like evidence on a silver platter. By 3 a.m., the job was done. The cement gleamed under the halogen lights, smooth and flawless. We packed up everything, cleaned the street, and I made sure the motion sensor camera I'd mounted on my mailbox was angled just right. It covered the entire path. If anyone walked across it, I'd know. Nate clapped me on the back and said, "You know, most people pour driveways or patios. This is the first time I've poured poetic justice." I grinned. "You've got no idea how poetic it's about to get." When I finally went to bed, it was nearly dawn. I slept for maybe 3 hours before the sound of furious yelling snapped me awake. I stumbled to the window, and couldn't believe what I saw. Cheryl and Lorna were pacing back and forth in front of the new cement path, their faces twisted in disbelief. Cheryl wore a bright red robe and fuzzy slippers, stomping her foot at the edge like a toddler denied candy. Lorna had a garden rake and looked like she was debating using it as a weapon. They circled the path like sharks, inspecting the signs, tapping the surface, pointing at the etched text. I could almost hear them screaming through the glass. Then, Cheryl did exactly what I hoped she would. She stepped right onto the cement. Her slippers sank just enough to leave a beautiful, full-print impression. Then Lorna followed. She slipped slightly and stumbled forward, dropping her rake into the wet surface. She let out a shriek loud enough to make the neighborhood dogs start barking. I grabbed my phone and opened the live camera feed. There it was. 2 perfect footprints and a gardening tool stuck like Excalibur in the stone of consequences. I hit record. The sisters argued back and forth, blaming each other. Cheryl claimed the cement wasn't dry. Lorna yelled that it looked dry. Cheryl snapped that the sign was fake. Lorna said the sign had city seal stickers. They started pulling at each other's sleeves, trying to drag one another off the path, which only made more marks appear. It was glorious. Minutes later, they retreated, defeated and humiliated, back to their house. I waited until noon before casually walking outside with a cup of iced tea. I stood by the path like nothing had happened. Soon enough, Cheryl returned, dressed now and trying to act composed. "You need to remove this," she demanded. "This is obstruction. The HOA will hear about this." I took a sip and said, "Funny, that's exactly what I said to you 3 days ago." She crossed her arms. "You poured cement on a community trail." I tilted my head. "You mean the illegal trench you dug on my private lawn without permission?" "Yeah. I fixed that." "You're welcome." She tried a different tactic. "The path connects important parts of the neighborhood. People use it. It's for the greater good." I motioned to the sign. "Then they can walk around. My yard is not a sidewalk. And according to the city, this path is now a legal improvement. And according to my camera," I added, pointing to the mailbox, "you owe me for damaging the wet cement this morning." Her face drained of color. You recorded us? The whole thing, I said. Including the footprints. And the rake. Oh, and your little monologue about me being an obstacle to progress? Solid content. Thinking of sending it to the HOA board. Cheryl fumed, turned, and stormed off again. But this time, she didn't step on the cement. Later that evening, I reviewed the footage and uploaded it to a private neighborhood thread titled, Property Restoration Progress. I didn't comment. I didn't explain. I just let the video speak for itself. Within hours, reactions poured in. Some neighbors laughed. Others expressed admiration. A few stayed silent. But one thing became clear. The tide was turning. By sunset, Cheryl and Lorna were nowhere to be seen. Their trail had been buried, both literally and metaphorically. And as I sat on my porch, watching the concrete cure under the orange sky, I knew this was only the beginning. The Karens weren't done. Not by a long shot. But neither was I. And this time, I had the high ground. Cemented, stamped, and set. By the next morning, the footprints had become something of a neighborhood art piece. People walking by slowed down, tilted their heads, and smirked at the clear impressions of slipper soles, one right next to a half-embedded garden rake handle that had now hardened in place like a marker of shame. No one said anything outright, but the smirks and muffled laughs said it all. Cheryl and Lorna had managed to step right into their own trap. I couldn't have designed a better symbol if I tried. Even the local mailman, a guy who never so much as waved, gave me a thumbs up and said, "Nice work." About time someone stood up to them. But not everyone was pleased. Around noon, a folded sheet of paper appeared tucked under my doormat. It was printed in Comic Sans, decorated with a low-resolution HOA letterhead, and addressed to me by my first name spelled incorrectly. It read like a threat written by someone who learned legalese from daytime television. Cheryl, apparently working in full damage control mode, accused me of malicious obstruction of community property, environmental sabotage, and emotional damage. She claimed Lorna had twisted her ankle while fleeing the cement and would be filing a complaint. There was no signature, but the last line read, "We will see you in community court." I wasn't even sure what that meant. Community court? Was that a euphemism for HOA gossip circles? I laughed, but not because it was funny. It was absurd, and absurdity was dangerous when fueled by delusion. Cheryl and Lorna weren't just embarrassed. They were cornered. And people like that don't retreat quietly. They regroup, they escalate, and they get creative. I knew something bigger was coming. Sure enough, by that evening, the HOA Facebook group was ablaze with cryptic posts about hostile neighbors, property bullies, and those who refused to share. Someone even posted a blurry photo of the cement path at an awkward angle, claiming it was dangerously slippery and impossible to navigate with strollers. A few sympathetic replies rolled in, mostly from the Karen's inner circle, but the overwhelming response leaned toward amusement. One neighbor commented, "Looks safer than the muddy trench from last week. Maybe y'all should just leave him alone." That didn't stop Cheryl and Lorna from trying again. 2 days later, I came home to find a group of people standing on the sidewalk near my yard, clipboard in hand. Cheryl was in full performance mode, explaining to them how she and her sister had been unfairly targeted while trying to improve the neighborhood. She pointed at the cement, dramatically outlining where the path used to be, then gestured at the footprints as if they were evidence of a crime committed against her. "That's my slipper mark right there," she said, as though proud of it. The people with the clipboard turned out to be a couple from the HOA Oversight Committee, reluctantly dragged out for a community impact review. I joined the scene quietly and waited for Cheryl to notice me. When she finally did, her face locked into that tense smile she used during HOA meetings when she wanted to look civil but was dying to scream. "Good afternoon," I said calmly. "You must be here to assess the newly repaired portion of my yard." One of the oversight members looked confused. "Repaired?" Cheryl jumped in. "Illegally modified. It used to be a shared community trail. He destroyed it without authorization." I pulled out my laminated copy of the city property line survey and gently handed it over. Actually, the trail was built on my land without consent. The new path was poured within my legal boundaries. With permits. I even have the inspector's signature if you'd like to see it. Cheryl's jaw tightened. The couple reviewed the papers, flipped through them, then exchanged a quiet glance. It seems, one of them said, that Mr. Hale is within his rights. The cement appears compliant. And those signs are clearly marked. Cheryl tried one last time. But what about the emotional impact? The kids used to run through here. It was a joy trail. I raised an eyebrow. A joy trail? It was a ditch with flamingos. And your sister left a rake embedded in my yard. The woman stifled a laugh, then cleared her throat. Let's wrap this up. Thank you both. They left, and so did Cheryl, but not before glaring at me like I had stolen her dog. The rake, now fully hardened into the cement, had become a neighborhood meme. Someone put googly eyes on it. Another neighbor anonymously dropped off a small garden gnome next to it with a sign that said, "Trail closed." The cement walkway that was supposed to be a battleground had become a monument of petty defeat. But I knew Cheryl wouldn't let it rest. She had tasted power for too long to just walk away. That weekend, things got serious. A letter from an actual attorney arrived. Or at least, someone pretending to be one. The letterhead was suspicious, and the grammar was laughable. It accused me of impeding civil liberty of walkspace, and warned that a lawsuit could be filed for emotional damage and reputation harm. I called my real attorney, an old friend named Melanie, and sent her the letter. She called me back 5 minutes later laughing. This was written by someone who's either 15 or thinks Judge Judy is legally binding. She offered to send a formal response. Make it sharp but polite, I said. Let's not just win this. Let's win it beautifully. While Melanie handled the legal side, I focused on reinforcing the walkway. I installed solar lighting, added low-maintenance flower beds along the edge, and even placed a bench nearby for decorative purposes. It was no longer just a sidewalk, it was art. And more importantly, it sent a message. I wasn't backing down. Then came the twist I didn't expect. A package arrived addressed to me with no return name, just a P.O. box. Inside was a printed photo of me pouring cement at night, clearly taken from across the street. No note. Just the photo. I stared at it, confused. Someone had been watching. Someone knew. At first, I thought it might be Cheryl trying to intimidate me, but then I remembered. She had been in that HOA meeting out of town the night the cement was poured. That meant someone else had been watching. Someone not on her team. Someone who hadn't said a word until now. It gave me pause. I scanned the street later that evening, eyes lingering on windows, wondering who else had seen the whole thing unfold. Maybe it was Jim, the neighbor who slipped me that warning note. Maybe someone else had been rooting for me silently, waiting for a reason to come forward. Whatever the reason, it told me one thing. This wasn't just a feud anymore. It had become a neighborhood event. People were choosing sides, even if they weren't saying it out loud. The Karens might have started this, but now the whole street was watching how it ended. And the funny part? For all their talk of building something for the community, they had made one critical mistake. They never asked anyone what the community actually wanted. They assumed control. And now, that assumption was crumbling beneath their feet. As the sun dipped below the rooftops, I sat on my porch again, tea in hand, looking out at the cement path bathed in soft amber light. It wasn't just a walkway anymore. It was a line in the sand. One that they crossed. One that I rebuilt. And I had a feeling that line was about to mean a whole lot more. Because the next move was coming. And if I had learned anything about Cheryl and Lorna, it was that they never went down without dragging something dramatic behind them. But this time I was ready. The calm didn't last. Cheryl and Lorna disappeared for a couple of days, which should have been a relief, but instead it felt like the eye of a storm. Their silence wasn't retreat, it was preparation. I kept checking the HOA forum, the neighborhood Facebook group, even the city permit portal, waiting for some sign of their next move. It finally came on a Thursday morning, when I stepped out to grab the newspaper and noticed something taped to my mailbox. A fresh notice of violation, stamped with the HOA seal, declaring that my new cement path was incompatible with neighborhood aesthetics and an unapproved hardscape addition. They'd fabricated a new rule. And I knew exactly who wrote it. I walked straight to the HOA office, which was just a glorified rented room above the town bakery. When I arrived, Cheryl was behind a folding table, typing with a level of intensity usually reserved for nuclear launch code. Lorna sat beside her, sipping iced coffee and watching something on her tablet with a grin. "Ah, Mr. Hale," Cheryl said without looking up, "I assume you're here about the notice." "I am," I replied. "And I'd like to know what regulation I violated this time." She finally looked up. Subsection B7, page 4. Visual Harmony Clause. It clearly states that any exterior modifications must match the established aesthetic of the neighborhood. "That clause doesn't exist," I said. "It does now," Lorna chimed in, waving her tablet like a gavel. "We added it in the emergency HOA meeting 2 nights ago." "You mean the one you held without notifying any homeowners?" I asked. Cheryl smirked. "We notified the board. That's all that's required." It was so brazen I almost laughed. But instead, I pulled out a copy of my city-approved permit and placed it on the table. "This trumps your fake meeting. And if you push this, I'll have my lawyer file for harassment." Cheryl glanced at the paper but didn't touch it. "This isn't a legal matter," she said. "It's a community matter." "Then the community can speak," I replied. "Let's put it to a vote." Her lips twitched. "Fine. But you should know," she said, "there's still an unresolved complaint about the injury caused by your cement path." "You mean the one caused when you trespassed on wet cement?" "That's your version," she said, standing up. "We'll see what the HOA board thinks." Back home, I knew I had one shot to end this. Cheryl and Lorna had abused the system for too long, rewriting rules to suit their personal vendettas. I wasn't just going to defend my cement path. I was going to put their whole reign under the microscope. So I began compiling emails, photos, witness accounts, screenshots from the HOA Facebook group, the surveillance video of them destroying my yard, and even the ridiculous cease and desist letter with all the spelling errors. I contacted several neighbors, including Jim and the elderly couple 2 doors down, both of whom had quietly but consistently supported me. When I explained what I planned to present at the next HOA meeting, their response was the same. Finally, the night of the meeting, the room was packed. Not just board members, but actual homeowners, many who hadn't attended in years. Word had spread. The cement incident had triggered something bigger than a neighborhood squabble. People were fed up. Fed up with fines for flower pot colors, with threats over fence heights, with the constant power grabs disguised as community betterment. Cheryl stood at the front like she owned the place, clipboard in hand, Lorna at her side whispering like a shadowy advisor. "Let's begin," Cheryl said. "We're here to vote on the unauthorized hardscape modification located on Lot 112. Hold on," someone interrupted from the back. It was Mr. Kwan, the retired engineer who never spoke at meetings. "Don't we want to hear the whole story first?" Cheryl faltered for a second, then nodded tightly. "Fine. But keep it brief." I stood and walked to the front. I didn't raise my voice or wave my arms. I simply presented the facts. I showed the footage of Cheryl and Lorna digging the illegal path, the damage to my lawn, their public Facebook posts bragging about it. Then the footage of them stomping through the wet cement, the prints still visible today. I passed out copies of my permit and read aloud the letter from the city code office confirming I had done nothing wrong. Then I played the voicemail from my lawyer explaining the legal protections of property improvement. The room was silent. Then someone started clapping. It was Mrs. Green, the sweet widow who always walked her poodle by my house. One by one, others joined. Cheryl tried to interrupt. This isn't about legality, it's about harmony. No, Jim cut her off. It's about you two using the HOA to bully everyone on this street. Murmurs of agreement followed. You fined me for a pumpkin on my porch in November, someone else called out. You tried to charge me for kids drawing chalk on the sidewalk, added another. The tide had turned, and Cheryl knew it. Her face twisted in a desperate smile. We're just trying to maintain standards. No, I said calmly. You're trying to maintain control. The board voted. Not only was my cement path declared valid and protected, but a motion passed to suspend Cheryl and Lorna from any decision-making power pending a full investigation. A temporary board was appointed, and for the first time in years, people clapped at an HOA meeting for the right reasons. Cheryl and Lorna left in a huff, muttering about mob mentality and ungrateful neighbors. I walked out into the night, tired but relieved. I had stood up to them, and this time the neighborhood stood with me. But just as I turned onto my driveway, I noticed something strange. A puddle near the base of the cement path. Odd, since it hadn't rained. I knelt down and realized it wasn't water. It was a thin stream of muddy runoff. I followed the trail with a flashlight, tracing it back across the edge of my lawn, down toward the fence. Then I saw it. A makeshift trench had been dug behind my yard, running from the Karen's side garden straight toward my property line. It was shallow but intentional, like a tiny riverbed meant to carry excess water, and it had already begun trickling across my land. I stood there, stunned. After all that, after the meeting, the evidence, the vote, they were still trying to sabotage me. They couldn't beat me through rules, so they were turning to underhanded tactics. Redirecting stormwater runoff wasn't just petty. It was a violation of municipal code, not to mention incredibly damaging if left unchecked. I took pictures, videos, and samples. I wasn't about to let them get away with this again. The next day, I called a drainage inspector and showed him everything. He examined the trench and confirmed it had been intentionally dug. This isn't erosion, he said. Someone shaped this deliberately. We've had a few complaints like this, neighbor feuds turning into water wars. So what happens now? I asked. I file a report, and if they don't remove it, the city fines them. Heavily. And you can sue for property damage. Later that evening, Cheryl came storming over. You had a city guy snooping around my bushes? She demanded. I had someone inspect illegal runoff threatening my lawn, I replied. Which you created. Again. This is harassment, she hissed. You're targeting us. You dug a ditch onto my land, I said. You broke the law. Again. She backed off, but I could tell this wasn't over for her. And for once, that didn't worry me. Because now, I wasn't the one fighting uphill. Now, every step she took just sank her deeper. And like the cement path in my yard, the foundation was already set. The morning after the runoff discovery, I woke to the sound of a backhoe. For a split second, I thought maybe the city had come to fix the trench already. But when I pulled back the curtains, I nearly dropped my coffee. Parked across Cheryl and Lorna's driveway was a rented mini excavator, and Lorna was at the controls. She was wearing a reflective vest far too large for her, and a bike helmet strapped tightly under her chin. Cheryl stood beside her directing like a traffic cop, wildly waving her arms and yelling, "A little deeper! Make it slope! Make it fast-moving!" My jaw dropped. They were actually expanding the trench. In broad daylight. In full view of the street. Like it was the grand opening of the neighborhood canal. I grabbed my phone and recorded the whole scene. It was so surreal that it almost felt staged. Lorna was completely oblivious to the controls, jerking the machine around as she dug an uneven gash deeper into the earth, while Cheryl ran around placing tiny yard flags to mark what she called the natural water flow design. Within minutes, water from their garden hose was running directly through the trench and into my property again. This time it bypassed the previous channel and flooded one corner of my flower bed. That's when I realized they weren't just trying to damage my lawn. They were trying to ruin the cement path itself, hoping erosion would do what the HOA couldn't. I called the city inspector immediately, sent him the footage, and before noon he was back with 2 officers from the Department of Code Enforcement. They stood at the edge of my lawn, shaking their heads as Cheryl argued that it was just a community irrigation project. One of the officers interrupted her with a dry, "Ma'am, you can't conduct hydrological engineering across private property without permits." Cheryl fired back with a rant about native plants and tribal water right. Lorna shouted something about a documentary she saw on drought-resistant landscaping. The officers were unimpressed. It didn't take long. The trench was ruled a violation of local code, and Cheryl and Lorna were served an immediate cease and desist. The mini-excavator was towed that same afternoon, and they were hit with a hefty fine for unauthorized land modification and property damage. And yet, they still wouldn't let it go. That night, I caught Lorna in my yard again. She was crouched near the edge of the cement path, holding what looked like a bottle of vinegar. When I stepped outside and cleared my throat, she dropped it and bolted, tripping over one of her own flamingo decorations still stashed behind the bushes. I could have called the police. I could have pressed charges. But I didn't. Instead, I turned all the footage over to my attorney and let her do what she does best. Melanie had already compiled a growing stack of violations, emails, threats, and photos, and now she added trespassing, attempted property vandalism, and malicious environmental interference to the list. By the end of the week, a formal civil complaint was filed. Cheryl and Lorna were being sued for property damage, harassment, and emotional distress. The amount wasn't astronomical, but it was enough to make them sweat. And based on the panicked screeching I heard coming from their kitchen window the day they were served, it landed with impact. The lawsuit triggered something unexpected. Neighbors started coming forward. Quietly at first, side conversations, late-night texts, anonymous note. Then louder. People began documenting their own experiences with the Karen sisters. One neighbor admitted she'd been fined for having wind chimes. Another revealed Cheryl had once tried to ban lawn chairs that weren't symmetrical with house architecture. Stories poured in. People who'd been silenced or isolated by the constant threat of fines and citations now had someone to rally behind. That momentum led to something bigger. A group of homeowners called for a full HOA audit and special election. For years, Cheryl and Lorna had run the board like a monarchy, rewriting rules, ignoring complaints, and silencing dissent. Now, people were done. In a matter of days, signatures were gathered, petitions filed, and a new election scheduled. The HOA's reign of terror was unraveling. The night of the election felt like something out of a courtroom drama. Folding chairs lined the local community center, and nearly every homeowner showed up. Tension crackled in the air. Cheryl entered late, dressed like she was going to court, gray blazer, pearls, a manila folder tucked under her arm like it held the secrets of the universe. Lorna followed behind, arms crossed, glaring at everyone. When the floor opened for public comments, neighbor after neighbor stood to speak. Calmly, firmly, respectfully. But each story chipped away at the illusion of authority the Karens had clung to for years. I didn't even need to speak. The evidence had already spoken for itself. When the votes were finally counted, it was a landslide. Cheryl and Lorna were officially removed from all positions within the HOA. A new board was elected, diverse, reasonable, fair-minded people who actually listened. As the results were read aloud, Cheryl stood silently, lips pressed tight, face a mix of rage and disbelief. Lorna muttered something about suing everyone and stormed out, knocking over a trash can on the way. No one followed. A week later, my cement path received a fresh sealant coat, and I added solar lighting along the edges. The rake that had hardened into the surface remained. It had become a symbol, not just of Karen's failure, but of what happens when you stand up to bullies with a smile and a permit. I mounted a small plaque at the entrance that read, "Community begins with respect." People chuckled at it, but they also got the point. The funniest part? A few neighbors actually asked me if they could replicate the path design in their own yard. One even offered to pay me to consult on their garden layout. I wasn't a landscaper, but the fact that the very thing the Karens had tried to destroy had now become a point of inspiration felt like poetic justice. The cement was more than just dried concrete. It was the line they crossed and the wall they ran into. By the end of the month, Cheryl put her house up for sale. Rumor had it she couldn't walk down the street without getting side-eyed. Lorna tried to rally a few final insults in the Facebook group, but no one engaged. She eventually deleted her account. They faded away not with a bang, but with a whimper, their legacy cemented as a cautionary tale. As for me, life returned to normal. Peaceful walks through my garden. Laughter from across the street. Kids drawing chalk messages on the sidewalk again. People smiling without fear of a fine. Every now and then someone would bring up the path and say, "I can't believe they actually tried to build a trench through your yard." I'd smile and reply, "And I can't believe it only took cement to stop them." The story didn't need revenge. It didn't need shouting or threats. It just needed boundaries, clear, firm, and unapologetic. Because when entitled people push too far, sometimes all it takes is a slab of concrete to remind them the world doesn't revolve around their shortcut. And in this neighborhood, the line had finally been drawn. Permanently.